Okay, I guess we'll get started. My name is David Carr. I manage the Starry Stonewort Collaborative at the Finger Lakes Institute at Hobart William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York. Thank you all for being here. I see we've got people here. I recognize some names from, of course, New York State where we are, but I see Canada, I see Minnesota and Wisconsin. So thank you all for being here. This is our third already. I can't believe the summer's gone by this quick. Our third webinar for the summer. Briefly, keep yourselves on mute, as most of you are, I think, just to, some of us are still working at home, and there's always, dogs barking, fire engines, and those good things, and keep it quiet for the presentation. If you have questions, please use the chat box, and we will run through those at the end of our presentation. Today, we're very happy to have Dr. Doug Pullman with us. I had the pleasure of meeting Doug in person a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, I think, at the North American Lake Management Society meeting. And we actually had a funny conversation about new and different rake designs for rake tossing. But anyway, it was really nice to meet him in person. And since then, we've been on a couple of different calls together. Doug, very briefly, and he can fill in the blanks here. Doug has, in his past, has studied at 5 different universities and worked as a researcher for about 5 years. And then he became the tech lead at Signet Enterprises, and before founding Aquest Corporation 30 years ago. So I'm not commenting on Doug's age here, but he's been in it a long time, and he knows a lot of what he's talking about here. Back in 2006 or so, he was talking with Dr. Bob Johnson on the telephone, and Bob Johnson is a well-respected researcher here in New York State. I think he's with Cornell now. And then Doug went out in a boat in a small Michigan inland lake and found and identified Starry Stonewort for the first time. And from then on, it's been himself and a number of others in the industry, and including the applicators and so on, started building, a database of where this stuff was, and ideas and method and how to treat it and what to do about Michigan's inland lakes, which have a pretty significant Starry Stonewort problem if you're not familiar with it. And so Doug is going to tell us about some of that and, the pertinent issues. I'm reading a thing he sent me. Pertinent issues that need to be considered with realistic expectations for successful management. So with that, Doug, take it away as you can here.
Well, thank you, David. By the way, I was really honored by that meeting that we had several years ago and all of our interactions ever since. And I was just saying to you a little bit earlier how much I think that you've contributed to this whole understanding of Starry Stonewort as an invasive species, and I wished we had more of this for other invasive species. I'm just noticing here that I'm doing this from home, and you may notice in the lower right-hand corner, that's Milton, my cat, and he wanted to be a part of this. This is one of his favorite topics, as it is mine. So really what I'm going to present though today is two decades of Starry Stonewort experiences in Michigan. As David said, I've worked only briefly as a researcher, but more for roughly 30 years as really a lake manager, although I've done some stints as research and development persons at a couple chemical companies since. But at any rate, I'm going to focus today though on what we've learned over these years of experience in Michigan with Starry Stonewort. So for some reason it doesn't want to, there we go. And it's interesting, we were also talking about, David and I a little earlier, about how Starry Stonewort has probably been in Canada for quite some time and it went unnoticed. And I can't fault anybody for that because I'm really, really guilty of this. As a lake manager, I'm generally trying to suppress invasive species, native or exotic for that matter, anything that's trying to reduce biodiversity in a lake. And of course, Cara has oftentimes been a desired species, one that we've not wanted to have any impact on because it has so many desirable characteristics. So it was in the late 90s, I started hearing from some lakefront property owners that their Cara was growing up almost underneath their dock. And this is terrible to admit, but I thought they must be crazy. You know, Cara just doesn't do that. Cara is a nice plant. And so we started seeing this more and more. I thought, well, what's wrong with this Cara? And it wasn't widespread, but I would say in a couple instances from the late 90s and a variety of lakes, we did have to figure out how to kill what we thought was super Cara. And again, this is a story of having good contacts with people. And as David mentioned, back then I was chatting with Dr. Johnson at Cornell about milfoil of all things, when he just happened to say, hey, have you seen Starry Stonewort? It's been quite a problem here in New York. Those kinds of communications are so important. I like to make a point out of it that it was February 6th that I went out to actually a fairly large lake, and where I'd seen this super Cara. And in poking around in early February, I found that first of all, it was there. It was, as Dr. Johnson had suggested, it was Starry Stonewort. I found the bulbils, the whole works. It was just like he said. But imagine it's February 6th, and back then in Michigan, it's really rare to be able to launch a boat, maybe an ice boat, but not my boat anyway. But I was able to motor around and find a lot of this, and it was growing up under the ice, just pressing against the bottom of the ice. And so we realized that we've been dealing with something very, very different. During 2006, I did sound the alarm with state agency people and really got some of their attention. Interestingly, this was February 6th, I was able to grab a bunch of samples and take them to the Midwest Aquatic Plant Management Society meetings, which were a couple weeks after this in Grand Rapids. So we all got a chance to look at it, and people started to look for it. Maybe not so seriously in the beginning, but I can say that in 2006, it's seemingly pretty much everywhere. In other words, it seemed as though the horse was out of the barn, and Starry Stonewort was going to be a major fixture in the aquatic flora of Michigan lakes, inland lakes. Let me go to the next one. Now, I need to frame this, at the beginning. What are the management expectations? I'm going to be talking here today primarily about nuisance control. This is that kind of short-term sort of thing where you eliminate a nuisance depending upon your objective. That might be for the season, or it might be you hope from year to year, but that generally is not attainable. So we're usually looking at, maybe depending on when it's treated or how it's treated, something that lasts anywhere from about 2 weeks to maybe a season-long control. And to be honest, that year-to-year control where you do something and it goes away has been too elusive. We've not been able to do that. In other words, the total suppression or eradication of Starry Stonewort, we've not figured that one out in Michigan. I do have a couple anecdotal instances where we may have succeeded in doing that. It was unintentional. We were actually doing some other kinds of treatments. But that one lake, we found a patch, obviously near the boat launch. We were treating wild celery. The Starry Stonewort went away, and we didn't see it again for 10 years. But I don't know that we really eradicated it, because this plant is incredibly elusive and very adept at tricking us and just doing things that we wouldn't expect. So we do know, like I said, quite a bit in Michigan after these 2 decades. The applicator community there has been dealing with it. Harvesting contractors, we work with them as well, oftentimes in integrated control strategies. But we do know one thing above all else, and that is that this plant is, I like to say, predictably unpredictable. It blooms when it wants to. It crashes when it wants to, and pays no regard to our plans, or even for that matter, the calendar. Let me give you an example. Before Gary Crawford and I published that article on Lakeline in 2010, which is one of the first articles on trying to alert people to the nuisance level that this plant can create. Prior to that time, we saw Starry Stonewort in Michigan really bloom and hit its maximum peak of biomass in the before the 4th of July. In fact, as soon as the ice went out, it was there. And if you look through that article, we make a lot of reference to this idea that Starry Stonewort was blanketing, as it was indeed, blanketing fish spawning beds and forcing them off the beds and interrupting their ability to successfully spawn during that year. Um, After 2010, so you can imagine, up to that time, we're all thinking, well, we want to get out early and we want to knock this stuff down so that the fish have acceptable areas for spawning. But after about 2010, it shifted its biomass maximum generally to after the 4th of July. Oftentimes it would hit a peak in August. And again, this is just a story about how predictably unpredictable this darn plant can be. It blooms and it crashes. And I put a big and there. The crashes are something that you really have to think about because depending upon how it crashes, that can have incredibly significant ecosystem consequences like blue-green algae blooms, or it can get in the way of your management strategies. And I'll show you a slide here in a little bit where you make these plans, you predict that you can go out and do something about this, and then it disappears on its own, it crashes. Actually, milfoil does that too. People don't like to talk about it that much, but it does occur. It just dies off on its own for inexplicable reasons. I want to point out that one of the things we've discovered in Michigan is it's fairly easy to identify once you get used to seeing it and popping the stems or the thalli, if you will, which is kind of like bubble wrap. Get used to the way it smells and the bulbils and the rhizoids and the way it branches. All those things make it fairly identifiable. And others have already covered some of that in the earlier webinars. But I also want to point out that it can be really hard to find. And one of the things that I found really alarming about 5 years ago in working on some systems is that if you use, and David, I have a really good rake. And so if you use that rake and scrape up some of these patchy, charoid, little patches you see on the bottoms of some lakes, it's almost unnoticeable. Some people refer to that as mulm that accumulates on the bottoms of these lakes. But I discovered that in scraping around the bottom, I pulled some of this up and it was predominantly chara or some charoid species, but looking more closely, I would find what was either Nitella or Starry Stonewort. And as I would pursue those areas after that, sure enough, I started seeing bulbils. So it was a non-nuisance form of Starry Stonewort hanging out with the chara. So in these particular instances, we realized that eradication might be really difficult because this darn stuff is hard to find. So you might get the big patches, the obvious ones, and it's lurking somewhere, hanging out with cousin chara, where it can come back and very quickly spread, easy go. It doesn't seem to have much problem getting from lake to lake or moving around in the lake, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. I'm just realizing now as I'm speaking, I should have shown, I had some good photos of some swans with Starry Stonewort draped around their necks like a necklace, if you will, because they really like to hang out where the Starry Stonewort is. Do they like the bulbils? I don't know, maybe. But a little trick that I've known is if I'm visiting a new lake, and I'll oftentimes go to where the mute swans are and say, oh, you've got Starry Stonewort over there. And usually I'm right because the swans seem to hang out there. One of the things we discovered very early on, and this is even before we positively identified it as Starry Stonewort, is this stuff is easy to kill. And the reason I say that is some of our early efforts when we used copper algicides, we were thinking, well, chara is really hard to kill with algicides because it's got that calcification all over its outside. So use a pretty potent dose. And our first attempts to knock Starry Stonewort down, and we weren't even trying to kill it at that point. We were thinking it was chara. We just like it to not grow so tall. But we succeeded in just wiping it out and had all the unintended consequences associated with that. And that was fish kill, low oxygen levels, it was a mess. And again, we just didn't realize we were dealing with something different that would be so easy to kill. However, as time went on, we found that, yeah, it might be easy to kill, but it's really hard to treat. And I'm going to discuss that in a little bit, why that's the case and why we need to keep this in mind. It's one of those pertinent factors that has to be considered when you develop a management plan. Selective treatment is possible. Obviously, if you're using an algicide like copper, you're not going to be killing um, higher plants. It also appears that Cara, especially those that are calcified, would be logically more tolerant of a copper algicide. So oftentimes you can really kind of select out for the Starry Stonewort. And then I refer you to the vast body of literature produced by Dr. John Rogers at Clemson University and his graduate students about the ecotoxicology of copper, which would again say that we can do this without having a lot of unintended consequences or impacts on invertebrates. I like to say this may not show up for the party. This is part of it being so unpredictable. And there's two places here later on I want to talk about this in detail. It's a management challenge in Michigan, but to be honest, it's not been the end of the world. The community, the management community, has really developed a number of really awesome tools and ways to manage this. And we've been able to keep it under control where there's been that commitment to do any kind of control. And I'd also like to say this too shall pass. At the end of this slideshow, I have one more thing. And it's something that we're seeing in Michigan lakes now, where we've had 20 years of Starry Stonewort, and now it's not coming back as such a nuisance any longer. Ecosystem impacts have been covered by others. If I could, though, reference a couple of these photos. If you look at the bottom left-hand photo, you wonder, what is that picture of? Well, that's blue-green algae or cyanobacteria bloom that happened after we had a unpredicted and unprecipitated wholesale collapse of Starry Stonewort in about a 235-acre lake in Michigan. And when it went down, it obviously that much biomass depressed oxygen concentrations. We had a huge pulse of phosphorus into that lake from the sediments, and a huge Starry Stonewort bloom, which we had to address. And that went on for about 3 terrible weeks. And the other thing that I have to point out is, if I wished I had an Odo phone here, because if you look at that picture, I look at it and I can remember the odor. It just smelled like 230 acres of rotting compost. It was horrid. And we didn't plan that. We didn't do anything to precipitate. It just did that on its own. If you go to the lower right-hand photo, that shows this attempt where we had actually tried to clear out the Starry Stonewort with an early season algicide application onto a known spawning area. The fish then went to there and they spawned. Our mistake was we didn't clear out large enough area. They spawned. It appeared that everything was going according to normal, but this darn plant grows so fast it re-encroached. We don't know how successful they were as a consequence because we didn't clear out large enough area. The uppermost photograph there, I don't know if you can see my arrow there, but if you look at that, that's red ear sunfish that actually spawned on top of Starry Stonewort, which is really pretty interesting. So how bad is it? There's been papers out, good papers describing how it can reduce species richness. Our years of looking at Michigan lakes would say that if it's not managed, you'll see a loss of biodiversity, or if it's inadequately managed. It will blanket areas and crowd out even the most aggressive invasive species. And of course, we can't emphasize enough the critical habitat loss that occurs when it covers spawning areas or covers woody habitat, as you saw in some of those earlier photos. People have covered that pretty well. So in Michigan, let's think about then what we know so far, and that is that management began before it was even identified. There was all kinds of rumblings about what's going on with our Cara, and so attempts have been made all along. At that point, of course, just to suppress nuisance conditions, not eradicate it. Innovations were developed by practitioners, but through trial and error. I work as a lake manager. I also have sprayed lakes. I've ridden harvesting machines, and I learned very early on that I don't tell them what to do. I just tell them what my expectations are. So when I say practitioner trial and error, I'm aware of some of the things that they do. I know that they're all legal, but it seems like oftentimes a practitioner will keep that secret kind of up their sleeve. And I don't blame them. If they're more effective than a competitor in managing this plant, more power to them. Again, I think our goal there is that we want to see the nuisance conditions from an ecological and recreational perspective mitigated. That's been my primary objective and when I oversee these management operations. Selective control is also cost effective, and this is really critical. In Michigan, I'm looking at from either what we call a haircut treatment, where you burn it down, or take it, control all the way to the sediments. The maximum cost you're looking at there is about $190 per acre. So that's pretty inexpensive relative to what it costs to manage milfoil, for example. The other thing that I'm going to talk about this in one more thing later on is that the impacts that it has on other invasive species will modify the kind of management response that we have. Again, it's a challenge. Eradication, I keep looking and hoping that we come up with something like this. I've been looking at biologicals. I've been looking at algicides as ways to deal with these darn rhizoids and the bulbils. It seems to be just a place where this plant is able to persist. Even when we try to treat early and we think we've hit it before it's formed bulbils, it still seems to come back. And these are the suspect bits and pieces of this plant that seem to allow it to parinate and go from year to year and elude our attempts at eradication. The other thing that if any of you've tried to grow this in mesocosms, as I have done here in Alpharetta at Applied Biochemists, you'll notice when it gets really stressed, which it usually was when I was trying to grow it, it would put out these parinating structures which kind of float around and help it to infest other areas. And again, so if you're trying to manage it, you're putting it under stress, it starts making these darn things. They float out of the area. And once again, it's another challenge for eradication because the darn thing, when it's stressed, it puts these out and spreads itself around again. Now, if it's managed properly, like I said, we don't, I'd like to say that it really isn't the end of the world when managed properly. Now, these are data from that Lobdell Lake from February 2006. I thought that was something that that would be interesting since it was that lake where we first identified it as an inland invader. Here's a couple of the metrics that I look at. You'll notice Lake Scan there. Lake Scan is a method that I use to evaluate the macroflora, the vegetational communities in inland lakes. I look at part of Lake Scan is to look at species richness, and that's the total number of species present in a lake. And that's standard. It's not Lake Scan. I'll get into that next figure down. But if you look at species richness, and this is Lobdell Lake, about 2006, we had been really battling a lot with milfoil. By about then, we were getting milfoil pretty under kind of a maintenance level control. We've never eradicated it, but we figured out how to keep it really well suppressed. And about that time in 2006 is where we found Starry Stonewort, but it had not yet come to totally dominate the lake. It really didn't totally dominate those 540 some acres until about 2008. But if you look at my numbers there, the number of species that we found typically in that lake actually increased over the time, while Starry Stonewort was also increasing in terms of its influence on the lake. So what was happening here? We were actively managing it. We were using copper algicides to suppress it and prevent it, even though it was still found throughout the lake, but we wanted to prevent it from having the deleterious ecosystem impacts that it can have by being so invasive and crowding out other plant species. So this lake, we have a very good budget. We've used algicides and herbicides for Starry Stonewort control there because most of that is done in the nearshore areas. We use harvesting sometimes for other things, but this is what we did there. And you can see that species richness from about 2008 actually increased while we were managing it aggressively. The biodiversity index with Lake Scan is done using a meander survey, but assigning data to points, kind of a hybrid point intercept study. The biodiversity index is not a Shannon index. If you look at historical records and try to compare lakes one to another, an index that's an even index really doesn't characterize a lake very well, because lakes with their bays and their channels are inherently uneven. So this is just the BOD 60 index is just basically based on the density of the plants and where they're found, how they're, with the percent occurrence they might be found throughout the lake. So if we look at this index, again, a higher number is better. From about 2008 on, we're doing a much better job in the milfoil management. Actually, Starry Stonewort was helping us to do that management. I'll come to that in a second. Managing the Starry Stonewort in the edges, you see that our biodiversity actually did increase because we were having a pretty positive impact on the suppression of both milfoil and the Starry Stonewort in critical nearshore areas. Now, on the other hand, the invasive weed index just looks primarily at the quality of the plant community, how weedy it might be considered. And it actually did increase over time because this index looks primarily at the percent cover of the various species. So we still had a lot of Starry Stonewort everywhere, still had a lot of milfoil everywhere. We managed it so people didn't see it, but it shows up in the weed index here as being actually increasing over time. Looking at now a bunch of lakes throughout the state of Michigan over time, found the the change in biodiversity. And as it relates to the dominance is another lake scan metric that you could ask me about later, but it is what it is. What's the dominance of the Starry Stonewort relative to biodiversity? And you can see that in some instances you get a pretty good R square, a relationship between Starry Stonewort and to overall biodiversity. But for the most part, we didn't see that correlation in these managed lakes. And here again, it's just kind of all over the board. So this was 17 lakes in 2014 that all infested with Starry Stonewort. And looking at biodiversity in those lakes and Starry Stonewort dominance, you can see that the data is pretty much all over the place. So with management, you look at this kind of statistical analysis, you go, yeah, it's probably not the Starry Stonewort that's driving things in that lake, it's other factors. So how bad is it when it's properly managed? That's got to be a question everybody's got to ask. And by properly, I mean we're reducing its nuisance level and we're reducing its ecological impact on desirable plant species. And if that is, what our desire is, typically these managed lakes, we've not seen a decline or in biodiversity. It may have actually increased because we've been effective in managing it. But I have to say, these are lakes where we're managing milfoil also. So this is a really good subject, and I keep talking about this for a graduate student, because in normal management practices and the kind of data we take, we can't say definitively that what we're doing in terms of management is really protecting these, but it might be a collaborative sort of thing or a concurrent thing that happens as we manage all the invasive species. And when a lake is managed that way, at least we can preserve those conditions that we find desirable, biodiversity, and hopefully over time even improve those factors as we manage them. Doesn't mean the weediness doesn't go away. Again, we're not eradicating anything here. Every year we're seeing the same amount or even sometimes more weediness. But as long as we manage that, we can mitigate or minimize the ecological implications of that and the nuisance conditions for recreation. So we do have in Michigan, obviously, we know we can suppress those nuisance conditions with our current technologies, mechanical and biocides. Just a little secret on that, seems like the applicators are using chelated coppers for the most part. either those that are just simply chelated, like Captain or Cutrine or Argos, or they might use one of those that has an adjuvant placed into the formulation, like Captain XTR or Cutrine Ultra, which has allyl limonene in it. And all of the applicators that I know like to put a very small amount of hydrothol 191. And that's pretty much gives them the assurance that they're going to kill the starry stonewort. And so, and different applicators have different ways of doing this. And that's, I leave that to them. That's kind of their proprietary knowledge. Now, timing is everything when you talk about management. I love this picture. We went from just a nice 2-foot tall, low growing starry stonewort meadow in this lake. It wasn't bothering anybody really, to in about 10 days or 2 weeks, it did this. That's 11 or 12 feet of water. Now, it's predictably unpredictable. So we thought, oh my gosh, this is a major recreational resource, 1,200 acres in a park system in Michigan. We had to do something. So we mobilized to do treatment. And by the time the applicator got out there, which is about 5 days from this photo, it had crashed and there was absolutely nothing to treat. Timing is everything. Now, why does it do this sort of thing? And this is important in terms of why it grows the way it does and how it does the things it does, and how we manage it more effectively. First of all, starry stonewort, it makes these mats that are like big blankets of insulation. Years ago, I pulled out my thermistor, and sure enough, if you look at the temperature on a sunny day over starry stonewort, in this instance, these are Fahrenheit temperatures. It's kind of a cool day, but the temperature above the starry stonewort on that cool day was around 69 degrees. If I'd done this in August, it'd probably have been higher. Just above the starry stonewort, it's cooler. And under the starry stonewort, it's cooler yet. Water, if you remember, it reacts quite differently at different temperatures in terms of its density. If you look at this density water relationship, it's pretty dramatic, meaning that everybody talks about thermal stratification in lakes. This also occurs in littoral zones, particularly where you have an insulating mat like starry stonewort. So imagine that the density of that water below the starry stonewort is quite a bit denser. And that has a significant impact if you're considering treating it with an algicide, because that algicide's probably been in the back of a truck. On a day like that, it was a sunny day, so it's probably, I don't know, mid 70s, maybe 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And you're going to place that algicide on top of this dense mat where the lower layers are much cooler, much denser. And I'll show you what happens. This is a movie, hopefully it will play here. And this is just dye being placed on top of starry stonewort. This is warm dye at the very beginning, and it does exactly what we should expect it to do. It floats upward to meet up with water that's of similar density, similar temperature. You can see that the dye is really just kind of dusting the top of the starry stonewort. Okay, now this is cold dye. We had ice up top, and we're pouring the dye over the ice, and you'll notice what's happening here. It's very logical. It's going down, seeking out water of similar density, and it's beginning to penetrate that mat. So this is a pretty important consideration when you want to treat starry stonewort. And again, this is why it can be easy to kill, but really hard to treat, because it's got this darn density layer thing going on. And it's very difficult to get your algicide into the starry stonewort mat unless you're set that at the right temperature, or you're doing you're using something like a weighted hose that places the algicide at the bottom of the mat, not at the top. But if you're using warm algicide at the top of the mat, you can see what's going to happen. Isn't that cool? I just love this movie. Now I got to get back here. Here we go. Stop. Next slide. So if you look here, this is an example of one of the applicators in Michigan. What you see tailing off the back of that airboat are what we call spikes. And he's actually treating starry stonewort. And those spikes are, in this case, the water was about 4 feet deep. So he's got the spikes just above the bottom of the lake there to inject the algicide down where it will do the most good. And trailing hoses would do the same thing. Another thing that we looked at was a targeted temperature assisted application system, which is a big chiller on the boat. But that's something that's still being worked on, where you actually chill the algicides and then inject them again where they do have the most impact. But in this particular instance, the weighted trailing hoses and the spike applications work pretty well. There's people still working on temperature modified herbicides and algicides. And I hope that work continues, but it's kind of on hold right now. So what we've learned then is that we can target, because of biochemical reasons, we can target Starry Stonewort. We have to look at, anytime we're using this kind of a strategy, we have to think about that. Is the plant susceptible? Are you going to get enough exposure time? With copper algicides, that's tough because they don't stick around very long, particularly in Michigan, where they become copper carbonate and are no longer biologically available to do anything other than be sand. And that happens oftentimes in a matter of hours. So that's a real critical issue. If you're going to use an algicide, a copper-based one, you want to get it down where it belongs, because it's not going to be there and be effective very long. Total biomass is important. This is an algae. It's not a vascular plant. So the amount of biomass, you have to have a lot of algicide there to kill a lot of biomass. And then you also look at your dose rates, combinations of adjuvants that might provide some synergies, like the hydrothol 191 I mentioned earlier, or sodylimonene. How's the water moving? This is all just standard chemical application to waters. Water hardness is really important when you're using algicides. Hard waters deactivate copper algicides, so you may have to change your rates according to that. Biotic interference, we worry about the impact of the microbiome on the surface of plants. Older plants are harder to penetrate because there's a microbiome there that will interfere with uptake. How rapidly is the plant metabolizing? In the case of Starry Stonewort, what if it's just about to die? It's not going to really take up anything, but it might go away on its own too. So you have to think about that. Thermal properties, the application zone, of course, weather and all that. These are all common factors that are considered anytime you use an aquatic herbicide. Now, again, the crash phenomenon is important, and I keep talking about that. If you're seeing this kind of opening in a Starry Stonewort mat, or you look around and find, like in the lower right hand there, a lot of yellow at the bottom, you can plan to treat these areas, but they may be on their way out on their own through a process known as programmed cell death. So they might just go away on their own. It makes it really difficult to plan management. This plant is just so unpredictable. So again, we look at Starry Stonewort from this perspective. I want to get maybe in some of the biology things that people don't really talk about that much. How it is that this non-vascular plant that I just referred to can get so tall? If you look at these particular figures, which I did the same time I did this temperature figures, you'll see that oxygen levels above a Starry Stonewort matter can be way above saturation. But under Starry Stonewort, they can be, in this instance, they're right about, still above saturation, but lower than anywhere else. It wasn't that thick or dense of a mat, or tall, I should say. But I think if you look at some of these taller mats, you'd see a real suppression of you see impacts on pH, but you'd also see nutrient levels as they're being released from the sediments being higher below these Starry Stonewort mats. And depending upon heating and cooling during your diurnal cycle is driven by sunlight. Water flows in these mats can be either up or down. If you imagine that it's having that kind of an impact on the just above sediment environment, where it can force the sediments to release nutrients, and then you couple that with what we see the normal circulation of water with solar radiation, well, shoot, there you go. It's got a de facto circulatory system. And that might be something we target as we look at more controls of this. If you look at ORP, which is reducing capacity, you can see in this instance, even though I still had a lot of oxygen, The ORP was really low. These are highly reducing conditions. And had I sampled the phosphorus, I bet it was pretty high in the lower part of that Starry Stonewort. As it waits for the sun to go away and as the surface waters cool, of course, that drives that circulatory system, which allows a non-vascular plant to grow 12 feet tall. This is just kind of explains what we see here. The production of volatile fatty acids also increases as phosphorus is released from the sediments. And that might, and I hope there's some graduate students here that'll look at that. But I'm wondering, I can't help but think at the bottom of these Starry Stonewort mats, you can smell the volatile fatty acids and sulfurous compounds. We also know those are phytotoxic. Is this what's happening? Is this why we're seeing these sudden crashes? If that mat really builds up, it's getting phosphorus, obviously. But if the accumulation of these toxins like volatile fatty acids is also increasing, and that is driven by the de facto diurnal solar powered convection system or circulatory system, it could be poisoning itself. I'm very suspicious that this is what's happening. I wish somebody would look at it in detail. And again, this thermally driven convection, this would just show, just to illustrate that how the phytotoxins, the volatile fatty acids might migrate up through a mat and actually kill it. This is my one more thing. And since I would say it's something that's arisen in Michigan over the last 5 years, this kind of like the elephant in the room. I almost didn't even like to talk about these things, but I'm going to do it anyway. First of all, Starry Stonewort from a nuisance perspective. You're seeing a photo here of an area that historically had been totally choked. This is the upper left-hand photo with milfoil. Over time, Starry Stonewort came in and created a blanket. And that blanket, by the time you get to the lowermost photo, you can see that has Starry Stonewort under it. But there's no milfoil out there any longer, and people can boat. In fact, people barely notice that it's there. This lake, actually, what we ended up doing is we left the Starry Stonewort alone. This is an area where historically we'd not seen much in the way of native plant growth. It was a little bit too deep. It was just a place where milfoil liked to grow and Starry Stonewort. And the Starry Stonewort was the better of the two alternatives. Ultimately, the Starry Stonewort went away. It crashed. It's not come back like it did in years past. And although that's the same photo that you saw in the upper left, it describes what we're seeing today. The milfoil came back. So we went from roughly $365 an acre to try to manage this milfoil to, if we had to do anything and just burn the top off of it, let's say keep the Starry Stonewort a little more distant from the water surface, that would cost at most $180 an acre, maybe even less, if we're just kind of trying to keep it from broaching the surface. And that's a pretty big savings in acres management. And when it all came back, which we didn't expect, it was really, it hit the budget pretty hard. This is, I think, something that lakefront property owners and lake managers are all dealing with. You just feel very uncomfortable thinking that you're going to not manage a plant that you know can have such terrible consequences in a lake. But in a lake where it's already dominating practically every square inch of the bottom, this kind of management strategy may make sense, especially in the neighborhood where this lake is found, where all the other lakes are filled with Starry Stonewort. So maybe it's justified. There's probably a lot of you rolling your eyes right now wondering, is this guy crazy? But it's something that as a lake manager and as I manage these lakes management budgets is something I've had to consider. It does provide effective control of nuisance ebrid milfoil. Ebrid is the hybrids that we see throughout most of Michigan now. It's pretty much dominates. There's still some Eurasian around, but the ebrids seem to grow a little bit better. It does provide clear water in these lakes, clearer water than they had before they had Starry Stonewort. It often grows where nothing else will grow, so we've never had records of native desirable pondweeds growing in some of the areas where we see Starry Stonewort growing. And even in this picture here, it doesn't impede boating, although you can see that boats are cutting trails through this particular mat. it can be managed in a way where you don't eradicate it or take it even to the sediments. Just give it a haircut so it doesn't interfere with boating. Those are some of the treatment approaches then we're using in Michigan today. And that is the haircut treatment. That's algicide over the top surface of the plant, just to burn the top down, keep it away from the boats. On the other hand, if it's a lake where we don't have, if it's not a lake where we don't see it growing everywhere, and there's still a chance that we might really have a suppressive impact on it, and we want to protect it from getting into the shallow areas where a lot of our biodiversity is, we'll treat it and take it with those spikes or trailing hoses, and maybe someday with temperature controlled algicides. We'll take it all the way to the bottom, understanding that when we do take it all the way to the bottom like that, we still have those perinating structures like the bulbils or the floaters. So we have to keep at it. But maybe someday in a lake where it hasn't gotten away completely, we may be more effective in suppressing it. And the other thing is, it's also oftentimes used in herbicide combos. I'm going to refer to Lobdell Lake, some of our earlier management efforts there in the shallows. Is what we discovered is when the Starry Stonewort was there, as soon as the ice went out, we would go out and treat that Starry Stonewort, knock it down beautifully. We'd take it right down to the sediments in that case. But then the milfoil came just raging back and covered up. Again, we're trying to protect our native flora in this case. And the milfoil, of course, was matting out very quickly. So one of the things that we've had to do in lakes like that, where we know that's going to happen in the shallows, is that we treat concurrently for Starry Stonewort and the milfoil. And I think if you remember those, the biodiversity figures we saw in Lobdell Lake, that's worked pretty well. We've been able to see a resurgence of much more desirable plants. But that's kind of the one more things here, things that I find difficult to talk about, but I think that's the elephant in the room. There are some, from a recreational perspective, there's people that are going to see Starry Stonewort as having some real benefits. The other thing I wanted to say is, and I should go back, is that I'm seeing, and I don't have a lot of data on this, but there's been a number of lakes where we've seen Starry Stonewort totally dominate the system. And then over time, seen that it's just doesn't become a nuisance any longer, except in just isolated areas in the lake, like canals. It likes that. Areas where there's inlets from a slow flow, again, assisting it with that circulatory function that it so badly needs to get tall. So we are seeing that occur. And for that matter, Lobdell Lake, there was one area of that lake that for years, about 65 acres along a channel, a small creek, it dominated that area year after year after year. Haircut treatments kept it in tow. Good we would treat it to the bottom on the shoreline areas. Great biodiversity in that area, one of the highest biodiversity ratings of the whole lake. However, in 2020, the Starry Stonewort did not come back. And in that area where we would typically spend 65 acres, we were probably spending over the course of the season, maybe $180 an acre total. This year, we were up to our armpits, one of the biggest blooms of eBird water milfoil I've seen in my life. It was so dense. And at a cost of nearly $400 an acre is what it required to get that knocked down. We hope that it hasn't had too bad of an impact on our native flora. We tried to get at it quickly, went at it selectively, but it was, again, something that we just didn't expect. This is truly a unpredictable or predictably unpredictable plant. And when it comes to management, there's things like crashes that have to be considered that are precipitated by the plant all by itself, or is it going to have some desirable characteristics where you don't even treat it at all? And then as people are out there looking for it, keep in mind that it may be there and we're just not seeing it because it does seem to have a non-nuisance growth form where it just hangs out with cousin Cara and is there to foil our future efforts at managing it where it does become a nuisance. It's a lot of information. I presume there's some questions here, and I'm trying to think how I would get to those.
Thanks, Doug. That was fantastic. yes, there's a bunch of questions and a number of comments, which I always find interesting as well.
Okay.
The first one, if fragmentation can spread starry, why use mechanical harvesting as a means of control?
Oh, excellent question. You know what? Where we've done that oftentimes is where we've had so much biomass that it's really difficult to get an algicide. Plus, it would cost a lot to have that much algicide. So what we would do is to get that cost down, and where the harvesting machines are available is basically remove that biomass, and then within 3 days come back with the algicide. And that kind of 1-2 punch has been pretty darn effective. Probably more effective than you'd have to go back repeatedly with the algicide. And it's been in instances where the machines have been there sometimes for other purposes, and it's worked out really well. It's been cost effective, but the idea was to use the harvesting just to remove that really dense biomass. And understand these are lakes where they're 100% Starry Stonewort already. So if we did get spread, well, that horse is already out of the barn on those lakes. So those are the caveats that I have when we talk about harvesting Starry Stonewort. But if it's 100% Starry Lake already, that's the way I refer to them. You're doing that in an integrated program with the algicides. It makes a lot of sense to use that. And in this case, it saved us a bunch of money.
Thanks. The next is a couple of interesting comments from Scott. I was wondering, maybe Doug, if you can just read through those quick. And while you're doing that, I can take a question about an area in Canada. Trent Severn Waterway, we've got, and if the Canadians, I know there's people from Canada up there right now on this call, but I'll speak to what I know. There's a growing grassroots effort up there to get Starry Stonewort on the front burner and more recognized by the provincial and federal governments. We've got a lot of active citizen scientists up there in the Kawartha Lakes region in particular, doing rate tosses this summer and putting all that data into the EdMaps program. All of that will hopefully get it more in front of those that need to see it. But we got a lot of activity up there. If you're interested, I would, you talk to me further or talk to the Kawartha conservation people or the Kawartha Lake Stewards group. We're working with both of them. And in Southern Ontario, we've got what I'm calling a network has grown. It goes from Georgian Bay all the way over to Kingston and down to the towards Toronto for the Ontario Tech University. So they've got researchers involved, and virtually everybody up there is talking to each other, and this network is starting to take off. So yes, the Trent Severn Waterway's got a real problem with it, but it's finally attention is being brought to it and it's being reported properly at this point, and hopefully something will happen to get that more taken care of and some attention by the governments up there. Hope that helps. That's what I can tell you about the Canadian situation.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. One of the reasons the problem's so huge in Michigan is, despite the fact that we tried to form a Starry Stonewort task force with, at that time, Department of Environmental Quality, we just couldn't gain enough momentum, if you will, to do some of the things they're doing up there. So I have to say I'm a little bit jealous when I hear about something like that.
So we get a couple comments from Scott Banfield, who I believe is in Indiana. Yeah. I don't know if Doug, you could speak to those a bit.
Yeah, I think, Scott, the first one here is areas of rapid water movement where success with algicides might be difficult, might be a use case. He must be referring to harvesting. But obviously the potential for increased spread downstream would need to be weighed. And that's absolutely right. I did in one of my previous lives, we did do some harvesting in an area that was full of Starry Stonewort because algicides were just not an option. And actually, but we were targeting macrophytes more than Starry Stonewort even. And that weighs on, he's right. We're probably spreading it downstream, which is, something that has to be weighed and considered. And then I also noticed here, Scott was saying that he's seen significant loss of diversity in client lakes in northeastern Indiana, regardless of the extent of Starry Stonewort management. And it's, that could be, I sometimes wonder if had we done a better job early on at looking at lakes when we were managing these, even where we hadn't identified it yet, if that would have been the case. But it seems like at least the lakes that where I have records currently, we've seen that biodiversity at least is held steady and not necessarily declined. But that depends on the kind of lake you have too. How shallow is it? What are the other species that are present? So I'm familiar with some of those northeastern Michigan lakes, having gone to high school down there. So I guess I'm not surprised either, Scott. Scott knows how to manage stuff, and I totally believe in that. They're struggling with it.
Thanks, Doug. A comment from Kevin in Minnesota. He says they have lakes in central Minnesota that Starry Stonewort does impede boating.
Yes. Yep. And that's been the case in almost all of these lakes that I've referred to. Again, in many instances, we were either having to haircut it or take it to the bottom. Occasionally, where it grows on it really likes to grow on the drop-off areas of lakes. And sometimes there it grows at non-nuisance levels, despite the fact that it can be several feet tall. I like to reference one lake that was 27 feet deep, and the Starry Stonewort got to be 8 feet deep at 27 feet. Nobody knew it was there, and I wouldn't have even picked it up if it hadn't been for my graph, because at that point, I wasn't expecting it out there. So it's all kind of a relative thing. And as Kevin says, if it's impeding boating, then I guess the approach as a lake manager in Michigan that I'd take, if it's impeding boating, where is that? And do you haircut it to keep the milfoil away, which is probably going to impede boating even more, and it's more expensive to manage? Or do you just haircut it just to get it away from the boats? And that's been kind of the approach we've seen in Michigan recently. And then again, how fast does it grow in that particular lake? So let's say in Lobdell Lake, the Starry Stonewort is really slowed down. So if you haircut it, it may not come back for the whole season. Other lakes, you might haircut it and it'll be back in a week. So that didn't work so well. And you have to modify your management strategy.
Thanks, Doug. Ron Gamble's looking, he's wondering if you put the slide back up, the maybe 10 lakes listed, had the 2R² graphs. I don't know if you can put that up or not, but we can, if Doug can share his slide deck with me, I can make that available to everybody after the fact. And this video, we're being recorded now in Zoom, and we'll post this up on our library as well. I don't know if there's a specific question you had about that, Ron, but if you want to refer to it again, it'll be made available to you, I guess is the way that I'll say it. And then Scott's got a question, Doug, maybe look at that, about a client in Northeast Indiana.
Yes, I've seen a similar thing, and I bet, Scott, what you're referring to here is in some of the lakes where the Starry Stonewort has ostensibly had an impact to clear out most competing vegetation on those sediments, that we see that kind of filamentous algae development. Usually these are really murky sediments where it's hard for plants to grow, period. But I have kind of seen that. Again, most of the lakes that I'm referencing here do have pretty vibrant biodiversity. And so, I'm fortunate in that instance. But I think what Scott is referring to is pretty much what I've seen in some instances, where the filamentous algae might be the first thing in, and then the Starry Stonewort will take it over as the season progresses. I figure that's probably what he's referring to, because there's not much that can really compete with Starry Stonewort when it's growing strong. I mean, think about what we're saying here. Starry Stonewort can outcompete milfoil. It can outcompete filamentous algae. I mean, these are really nuisance, difficult to deal with plants, and it can outcompete them all when it wants to. I have to put that qualifier in, if you don't mind me being anthropogenic. But when it wants to, that can happen. So I think you could see that. You know, we see. I'm guessing that channel I referenced in Lobdell Lake, for example, the Starry Stonewort didn't show up in the spring. We had a ton of milfoil, but I've heard, I haven't been back on the lake yet, but I guess the Starry Stonewort is coming in pretty strongly now. And I guess I kind of expected that. So it's going to be the same sort of thing, but instead of filamentous algae, it's milfoil early, Starry Stonewort later.
Doug says algicides create a lot of controversy with potential negative impacts on fish, invertebrates, and so on, the general ecological health. What's your been your experience with controversy about applying algicides?
A ton of experience with this controversy. I mean, a lot of the problem is that when you register an algicide, for example, you do all your ecotox testing in beakers in a laboratory. But when you use copper algicides in the water, you're not, one of your biggest concerns is how do I, particularly where Scott is in Indiana, where we are in Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, where you have these really hard waters. The concern is how do you keep copper from becoming copper carbonates or other totally unavailable forms of copper. So if you go back, I would reference people to look up John Rogers' work on this. He's got over a decade of work looking at the ecotoxicology of copper, which in most instances would suggest that because it's so rapidly deactivated and the way the algae deal with copper, that the impacts on invertebrates or benthic organisms is virtually modified by chemical conditions, or we just have a huge margin of safety there. So I know that is a lot of controversy. I think a lot of that stems from the fact that misinterpretation of the literature. Now, if out where you are, where you've got the soft waters, that's a different situation. Copper is going to stay soluble for a lot longer, and it's going to be a bigger concern for you guys than it would be for us out here in these harder waters. But my biggest controversy is how do you keep the copper active long enough to have the desired impact and control the target organism? And again, I refer to how we were able to we actually treated areas to open up known spawning grounds. And the fish seem to have absolutely no problems then re-inhabiting those areas, spawning in those areas once again. And that's because the copper had become copper carbonate and had all the biological reactivity that sand does. So again, I would ask everybody to go through that body of literature and then use that body of literature to do your dose rates. Like I said, in really soft water systems, copper becomes a really difficult thing to use. So that's a different situation and has other considerations. But that literature will help anybody through that.
Thanks, Doug. And then Kevin has comments about percent frequency. If you could maybe address that one.
Yeah, percent frequency is tough. Do you remember some of the photos that I had, even like of the milfoil or the plants that would grow up through the Starry Stonewort? It was like a plant here or there. Now, on your traditional sampling techniques or monitoring techniques, if you find that near one of your meander points or your point intercept points, you're going to log it as being present. But you know that its density is really, really low. So you have to look at something more along the lines of this dominance approach. And that is, yeah, you might find all kinds of plants all over the place, but you know that Starry Stonewort is either totally dominant, or in the case if you're just looking at Starry Stonewort, you may barely, it might just be present within a quadrat. It might just be there on a rake toe, but it's insignificant, but it'll still show up as a percent occurrence, right? Because that's the way that's measured. So that's why I went through and worked these past 20 years. I actually focused a lot of my career on developing these metrics so that we can more accurately describe what we're seeing in lakes. And Kevin wants to talk about the dominance index. That's really important, or even the biodiversity index. Some of these that There's also a new nuisance index with Lake Scan because it's so hard, as Kevin refers to here. How do you really adequately describe this in a numerical and empirical fashion that you can run some stats on?
Right. Well, thank you. Any other questions for Doug? I actually have a quick question, Doug. Maybe it's not quick. You mentioned the crashing phenomenon.
Yeah.
We have a lot of lakes here in New York State, and of course, I don't know all of them, but that we do not see a crashing phenomenon. And is it water chemistry related, or hardness of water, or something, or do we not know? Is it
That's awesome. And there's got to be a graduate student out there, David, that would work on that. Because I think it comes back to the volatile fatty acid thing. So if it's growing, really well on a substrate that may not have the labile organics that another one might have. I hope I'm not getting too deep on this, but if it's not as productive of the volatile fatty acids or the phytotoxins, then I would presume that the crash phenomenon would not happen that often. But it's really important that we talk about that, because remember I mentioned that there's certain lakes where we've not managed the bottom growth, the deep water growth of Starry Stonewort, because it doesn't interfere with boating and it just keeps the milfoil out of an area that would otherwise be covered with milfoil. The lake where I showed you, that was a big lake, Oakland County, Michigan, where you saw the cyanobacteria bloom. It was that lake. And so we no longer let it just totally dominate the bottom of that lake, because we're afraid, what's worse? Really, a cyanobacteria bloom is worse than milfoil because of the public health implications. So we manage that deep water Starry Stonewort much differently. Again, it's a different instance, but we don't want it to totally dominate all the bottom of the area of that lake in case it crashes once again. I've not seen it crash again in that lake, but at the same time, we've not allowed it to do that anymore. And so that was very lake specific, and the way we manage it is different. So how would we manage the Starry Stonewort? On the bottom, that we go all the way to the bottom with the spikes. Just doing a haircut would be inadequate in doing that, because it's going to come back too quickly. So
Right.
that's the way it's managed in that particular lake in that particular instance. But the crash, I'd be looking for them. And again, somebody's got to look at this. I don't understand why we don't see papers on it, because this is a non-vascular plant that can grow 12 feet tall. This makes no sense. There's something going on there, folks, and we need to take a serious look at that. Not just from the interest standpoint, but there might be something there that we could look at in terms of management. As it's growing tall, we take advantage of the convectional heating and cooling system that's flushing water through those mats. That might be a way that we can manage it better. And so I'm hoping that if nothing else, that this talk might get some people interested in looking at sediment impacts mediated by these Starry Stonewort mats, and the impact on its growth and viability, even in terms of the crash phenomenon.
Good. And Scott has added in, he has not seen crashing in Northeast Indiana. So it's just interesting. So it varies, obviously, from location to location.
Yeah. Yep.
It's pretty amazing.
Now, I might also add, though, it can crash and return.
Mhm.
So, so everybody's out there watching for the crash. Crash and return does occur, and it can happen quickly. But so far in Michigan, I can probably think of, just off the top of my head, a good half dozen crashes, varying degrees, going from everywhere where the big lake, which is a wholesale collapse resulting in cyanobacteria bloom, to those Lobdell Lake, for example, where I actually did crash. It started crashing in November and didn't show up for the spring as we expected it. That's a different kind of crash. And you saw some of the pictures where you see those grooves starting to form. Typically, those will go down. But that if Scott's, that's might be something you look for, is those grooves. Or there's the other thing that was really fascinating is we get these holes in the Starry Stonewort mats, and there's like this bluish, chalky color that would water that would fill those. And I have no idea what that was. I'm not the only one to have seen them, but it's just another thing that I think bears out some investigation. What's going on here? I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that this is a non-vascular plant having a dramatic impact on sediment biogeochemistry.
Right. Well, thank you. We could talk about this all day, but we've gone over our hour here. So
Sorry.
no, it's all wonderful. It's all great information. So thank you everybody for hanging in. Thank you very much to Doug. Appreciate your time and all the research you're doing and have done over the years. And we'll hope to tune in next month. We got our next, we get Keith Gray from Integrated Lake Management next month. He's going to talk to us about diver-assisted suction harvesting, which there's growing interest in, I'm hearing out there. So thank you all very much. And again, thank you, Doug. And hope keep tossing rakes out there, everybody. Get the work done.
My
Thanks.
pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Take care.